I know, isn't it incredible? We're forever linked. We made one film. It's funny that remains. She was so jealous. She was a fool, my dear. We had a great percentage. If I had won that Oscar, we'd have made $1 million more on the film. That's what always happens. So she wasn't very smart about what she did.
The air in Golden Age Hollywood was thick with ego and Chanel No. 5. But no atmosphere was more combustible than the space between Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. Their rivalry was a masterclass in professional animosity, fueled by stolen headlines and a mutual, begrudging respect. From the set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane to Davis's scathing post-mortem reflections, their feud defined an era. This is the story of two icons who refused to share the spotlight, even in death. Origins of the Fire. In the shimmering, deceptive heat of 30s Los Angeles, the studio lots of Warner Brothers and MGM functioned as separate city-states, each with its own queen. Bette Davis, the fourth Warner brother, was the prestige actress. She was a woman who fought tooth and nail for scripts that allowed her to be ugly, flawed, and terrifyingly human. Across town at MGM, Joan Crawford was the star, a manufactured miracle of high cheekbones and impeccable lighting. Crawford had clawed her way out of a traumatic, impoverished childhood to become the personification of cinematic glamour. On the surface, they were opposites, but beneath the grease paint and the Klieg lights, they shared a terrifyingly similar jagged ambition. The spark that lit the fuse was not a role, but a man, Franchot Tone. In 1935, Davis was filming Dangerous and found herself falling deeply, and perhaps for the first time, in love with her co-star. Tone was sophisticated, cultured, and exactly the kind of intellectual partner Davis craved to match her own sharp wit. However, Joan Crawford, the reigning sovereign of the MGM backlot, had already set her sights on him. In a move that Davis would recount with venomous bitterness for the next 50 years, Crawford invited Tone over for dinner. According to Hollywood lore, she appeared at the door in nothing but a sheer negligee. By the time the sun rose, Tone was under Crawford's spell. They married soon after, leaving Davis humiliated on her own set. For Bette Davis, this wasn't just a romantic rejection. It was a professional declaration of war. She felt Crawford had stolen the one thing she wanted, simply because she could, using her body as a weapon where Davis used her mind. Davis won her first Oscar for Dangerous that year, but the victory felt hollow. As she walked toward the podium to accept the golden statuette, she saw the back of Crawford's head in the front row. To Davis, Joan was a mannequin who used sex as a tool. To Crawford, Bette was a scarecrow who lacked the grace to be a true leading lady. This initial theft created a permanent fracture in the firmament of the film industry. Davis began a lifelong campaign of verbal snipery. She famously remarked to the press that Crawford had slept with every male star at MGM except Lassie. Crawford, more calculated and protective of her public persona, opted for a killing with kindness strategy that drove the fiery Davis even more insane. Crawford would send Davis extravagant, congratulatory flowers and handwritten notes after every successful Bette Davis film premiere, knowing full well that Davis found the gestures transparent, patronizing, and deeply insulting. The battle lines were drawn. It wasn't just about Franchot Tone anymore. It was about the two different ways a woman could survive the meat grinder of the studio system. You could be the talent, or you could be the icon. You could be the actor who refused to wear mascara to play a dying woman, or you could be the star who never let a fan see her without a full face of paint and a mink coat. This was a war of philosophy, played out on the front pages of Luella Parsons's and Hedda Hopper's gossip columns. The world was watching, and the studios realized that a feud between two powerful women was worth more at the box office than a friendship could ever be. They were being fed to the lions, and both women were sharpening their claws. But the quiet resentment of the 30s was merely a dress rehearsal for the industrial-scale psychological warfare that the studio system was about to unleash upon them both. The studio system and Oscar heists. In the 40s, Hollywood was a factory, and Jack Warner was one of its most ruthless foremen. He understood a fundamental truth about the box office: conflict sells. While Davis and Crawford's mutual dislike was genuine, it was also a commodity that the studios meticulously packaged and sold to a hungry public. The studio system was a gilded cage where stars were bound by ironclad contracts. And for women especially, the fear of being replaced by a younger, fresher face was a constant, looming shadow. Jack Warner and Louis B. Mayer played on this insecurity like virtuoso violinists, often pitting their leading ladies against one another for the same scripts to ensure they remained competitive, desperate, and most importantly, profitable. The power dynamic shifted seismically in 1943 when Crawford, sensing her time at MGM was fading as they favored younger ingenues, made the unthinkable move to Warner Brothers' Bette Davis's home turf. Davis was livid. She had spent a decade establishing herself as the queen of the Warner lot, and she viewed Crawford's arrival as a direct invasion of her sovereignty. Crawford, ever the strategist, occupied the dressing room next to Davis and immediately began a campaign of aggressive friendliness. She sent gifts, roses, and even a gold-plated charm bracelet to Davis's daughter. Davis, seeing through the facade, reportedly threw the gifts in the trash and told her assistant, "I wouldn't sit on a toilet with that woman." The rivalry reached a fever pitch with the production of Mildred Pierce in 1945. The role of the struggling mother was originally intended for Davis, who turned it down with her trademark disdain, viewing the material as beneath her. Crawford, however, saw it as her last chance at relevance. She fought for the part, even agreeing to a screen test, a humiliating requirement for a star of her stature. Under the direction of Michael Curtiz, who famously called Crawford a has-been on the first day of filming, she delivered the performance of her life. When the Oscar nominations were announced, Crawford was the frontrunner. On the night of the ceremony, she pulled off one of the greatest PR stunts in Hollywood history. Claiming she had a debilitating bout of pneumonia, she stayed home in bed, dressed in a glamorous negligee, her hair perfectly coiffed, and a full face of camera-ready makeup applied. When she was announced as the winner for Best Actress, she invited the press into her bedroom. The image of Crawford clutching her Oscar under the silk sheets was beamed around the world, effectively stealing the headlines from the ceremony itself. Davis was incandescent with rage. For Bette, the Academy Awards were a sacred recognition of craft. For Crawford, to turn the win into a photo op was, in Davis's eyes, the ultimate vulgarity. This Oscar heist solidified their roles. Davis was the serious artist who felt cheated of the respect she deserved, and Crawford was the master manipulator who knew how to win the war of public perception. As the decade wore on, the roles for women over 40 began to dry up. The industry that had built them was now looking for reasons to discard them. This shared struggle against the patriarchy of the studios should have made them allies, but their history was too bloodied by personal slights. Instead of uniting against the system, they allowed the system to use their feud as a marketing tool. They became the architects of their own isolation, each refusing to blink, each waiting for the other to falter. By the time the 50s arrived, both women were considered box office poison, setting the stage for a desperate final collaboration that would become the stuff of cinematic legend. Driven by a mutual, desperate need for a comeback, they finally agreed to step into the ring together, unaware that their shared movie set would become the most infamous battlefield in the history of cinema. Whatever happened to Baby Jane? By 1962, the industry that had once worshipped at their feet had effectively moved on. Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were no longer the vibrant ingenues of the 30s or the dramatic powerhouses of the 40s. They were aging actresses in a town that had little use for women past 50. It was Crawford who discovered the source material, Henry Farrell's Gothic novel about two reclusive feuding sisters, and she was the one who approached Davis with the proposal. Crawford knew that alone they were fading stars, but together they were an event. Davis agreed, but with a caveat that stung. She would only do it if she played the title role of Jane, the ugly sister, leaving the wheelchair-bound, victimized Blanche to Crawford. The set of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane became a pressurized chamber of psychological warfare, meticulously documented by a press corps that smelled blood. From day one, the actresses drew lines in the dirt. Crawford, who had married the CEO of Pepsi-Cola, Alfred Steele, insisted on having a Pepsi vending machine installed on the set. Davis, in a move of pure, petty genius, responded by having a Coca-Cola machine installed right next to it. They communicated primarily through assistants, even when standing 5 feet apart. The air was so thick with tension that director Robert Aldrich later remarked he felt less like a filmmaker and more like a lion tamer. The conflict wasn't just about soft drinks. It was about the fundamental way they approached their fading beauty. Davis leaned into the grotesque. She designed her own makeup for Baby Jane Hudson, painting on thick, clownish white face powder, smeared red lipstick, and jagged eyeliner. She wanted to look like a woman who had rotted from the inside out. Crawford, conversely, refused to look anything less than a movie star, even when playing a captive in a basement. She insisted on wearing high-fashion negligées and false eyelashes, much to Davis's vocal disgust. Joan wouldn't go to the bathroom without her eyelashes on. Davis would later sneer. The psychological games turned physical during the filming of the famous kicking scene. In the script, Jane is supposed to brutally beat her sister. Davis, reportedly still harboring a quarter-century of resentment over Franchot tone, didn't exactly hold back. While Davis claimed she barely touched her, Crawford emerged from the take with a head wound that required stitches, claiming Davis had intentionally kicked her in the temple. Crawford's revenge was cold and calculated. In a subsequent scene where Jane has to drag the paralyzed Blanche across the floor, Crawford, knowing Davis suffered from chronic back problems, filled her costume with lead weights. She also made herself go limp, forcing Davis to strain every muscle in her body. Davis allegedly threw her back out, screaming in pain, while Crawford stood by with a serene, mask-like smile. Behind the scenes, the two women were also competing for the loyalty of the crew. Crawford was the gracious queen, handing out small gifts and handwritten notes to the grips and lighting technicians. Davis was the professional soldier, demanding perfection and berating anyone who fell short. They were fighting for control of the narrative, each trying to prove that she was the superior professional. Yet, as the film neared completion, it became clear that they had created something haunting. The raw, visceral hatred they felt for one another had bled into the celluloid, giving the film a terrifying authenticity that a friendly set could never have achieved. As the cameras stopped rolling, the temporary truce of the production shattered completely. The film was a massive hit, reviving both of their careers and birthing the hagsploitation genre. But the success didn't soften the edges of their rivalry, it only sharpened them. Davis was the one getting the critical raves, with reviewers calling her performance a brave masterpiece of self-loathing. Crawford, relegated to the straight man role, felt invisible. She watched as Davis was hailed as a genius, while she was once again dismissed as a mere personality. This resentment would culminate in the 1963 Academy Awards, a night that would become the final, unforgivable betrayal in their 50-year war. Davis believed she was on the verge of a historic third Oscar win, and she was prepared to savor the moment of ultimate victory over her rival. She didn't realize that Joan Crawford had spent the weeks leading up to the ceremony orchestrating a plan so Machiavellian that it would leave Davis stunned and speechless on the world stage. The Baby Jane era was over, but the real-life horror story was just reaching its climax. The tension on the set of Baby Jane had been a war of attrition, but as the 1963 awards season dawned, Joan Crawford decided it was time for a scorched earth campaign. The 1963 Oscars, the night of the sabotage. The 1963 Academy Awards remain the most cold-blooded evening in the history of the Oscars, a night where the statuette itself was used as a blunt force weapon. When the nominations were announced, Bette Davis was shortlisted for Best Actress for her role as Baby Jane Hudson. It was a chance for a record-breaking third win, a feat that would have mathematically finalized her superiority over Joan. Crawford, however, was pointedly ignored by the Academy. For Joan, the snub was a public execution of her ego. To be overlooked while her hated rival was being canonized was a humiliation she could not endure. Instead of retreating into the shadows, Crawford went on the offensive. In a move of staggering audacity, she contacted every other nominee in the Best Actress category, including Anne Bancroft, Geraldine Page, and Katharine Hepburn, who were all based in New York and unable to attend the ceremony in Los Angeles. Crawford made them a chillingly polite offer. If they won, she would be honored to accept the Oscar on their behalf. To the world, it looked like a gesture of professional solidarity. To Bette Davis, it was the sound of a trap snapping shut. On the night of the ceremony, Davis arrived at the Santa Monica Civic Auditorium confident and prepared for her coronation. She waited in the wings, her heart pounding, listening as the presenter prepared to read the name of the winner. When the envelope was opened and the name Anne Bancroft was announced, Davis felt the world collapse. She stood frozen as a shimmering, silver-clad figure brushed past her. It was Joan Crawford, who had spent the entire night backstage, perfectly made up, and dressed in a gown that outshone every nominee in the room. Crawford didn't just walk onto that stage. She floated. With a beatific smile that masked a killer's instinct, she snatched the Oscar and delivered a gracious acceptance speech for a performance she hadn't given, in a film she wasn't in. She had found a way to win an Oscar without even being nominated, effectively erasing Davis's moment and replacing it with her own image. Davis later said that she nearly dropped dead on the spot. "I will never forget the look on Joan's face," Davis recalled years later. "It was the look of a woman who had just committed a perfect crime." The sabotage worked. The headlines the next morning weren't about Bancroft's talent or Davis's near miss. They were about Crawford's legendary poise and her gracious act of friendship toward a fellow actress. Crawford had mastered the art of the star moment, proving that in Hollywood, perception was more powerful than performance. Davis, the artist, had been outmaneuvered by Crawford, the tactician. The wound never healed. Davis would carry the resentment of that night to her grave, viewing it as the ultimate proof that Crawford was not just a rival, but a sociopath in silk. This event marked the end of any professional civility between them. When they were cast together again for Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, the sequel of sorts to Baby Jane, the psychological warfare became so unbearable that Crawford eventually feigned illness to get out of the contract, fearing that Davis and director Robert Aldrich were conspiring to make her look old and foolish. She was replaced by Olivia de Havilland, and the two legends never shared a screen again. The 1963 Oscars remained the final, definitive blow, a night where Joan Crawford proved that if she couldn't have the crown, she would make sure no one else could wear it either. The physical battle may have ended when the cameras stopped rolling, but Bette Davis ensured that the war of words would continue long after the Klieg lights dimmed and the studio gates closed for good. Bette's final words and Mommy Dearest. When Joan Crawford passed away from a heart attack in 1977, the world expected the usual platitudes and respectful silences that followed the departure of a Hollywood icon. They did not get them from Bette Davis. While other stars offered curated memories of Crawford's legendary professionalism, Davis delivered a line that would go down in the annals of cold-blooded honesty. "You should never say bad things about the dead, only good. Joan Crawford is dead. Good." It was the ultimate exposure, a refusal to participate in the sanitization of a woman she had spent 40 years detesting. Davis's exposure of Crawford wasn't just a single quip, it was a sustained dismantling of the Crawford myth. In the years following Joan's death, Davis became increasingly vocal about the calculated mask Crawford wore. She spoke to biographers and talk show hosts about the tactical nature of Crawford's personality, how Joan used her children as props for publicity, how she manipulated directors with her sexuality, and how she was completely manufactured from the eyebrows down. Davis felt that Crawford had spent her life playing the role of a movie star, but had forgotten how to be a human being. To Davis, exposing Crawford's artifice was a matter of professional integrity. She wanted the world to know that the glamour everyone worshipped was a hollow shell built on ambition and insecurity. The exposure took a darker, more public turn with the 1978 publication of Mommy Dearest, the explosive memoir by Crawford's adopted daughter, Christina. The book painted a harrowing picture of Crawford as a volatile, abusive alcoholic who terrorized her children behind the closed doors of her immaculate Brentwood estate. While the public was shocked by the wire hanger's revelations, Davis felt a strange sense of vindication. Though she didn't delight in the abuse of children, she saw the book as proof of what she had always suspected, that Joan's public persona of the gracious, long-suffering mother was a total fabrication. However, the irony of the situation was not lost on the public. Just as Crawford's legacy was being shredded by her own daughter, Davis's daughter, B.D. Hyman, was preparing her own tell-all, My Mother's Keeper. Published in 1985, it painted Davis as a bullying, narcissistic alcoholic. The exposure had come full circle. Davis was devastated, not just by the betrayal, but by the fact that she was now being linked to Crawford in the one way she never intended, as a monster mother. Despite her own family scandals, Davis never backed down from her critique of Crawford. In her final years, she leaned into her role as the survivor of the Golden Age. She would often recount stories of Crawford's Pepsi-Cola politics and her desperation for attention. In a famous interview with Bryant Gumbel, Davis's eyes still flashed with a predatory spark when Crawford's name was mentioned. She didn't just want to outlive Crawford, she wanted to out-narrate her. She wanted to ensure that when history looked back at the two of them, Crawford would be remembered as the star who faded, while Davis would be remembered as the actress who endured. This period of Davis's life was defined by a refusal to go quietly. She watched as her contemporaries passed away or retreated into recluse-like states, but Davis remained on the front lines, often appearing on talk shows with a cigarette in one hand and a barbed comment in the other. She knew that her feud with Crawford was the one story the public never tired of hearing, and she gave them what they wanted with theatrical flair. By exposing Crawford, she was also keeping the fire of her own career burning, ensuring that the Davis-Crawford legend remained a centerpiece of Hollywood mythology long after the films themselves had moved into the realm of classics. In the twilight of their careers, the very system that had meticulously curated their beauty turned its back on them, forcing these two titans to forge a final grotesque legacy together. The cost of the crown. The ultimate irony of the Davis-Crawford feud is that while they fought for individual supremacy, they were actually locked in a synchronized dance of survival. By the late 60s, Hollywood had entered a cynical counterculture era where the polished artifice of the 40s was viewed as a relic. Both women found themselves shoved into a corner of the industry they hadn't planned to occupy, the hag horror or psycho-biddy genre. Because they were women of a certain age, with faces that carried the weight of decades, they became the faces of cinematic madness. Baby Jane had opened the floodgates, and for the remainder of their lives, they were offered roles that required them to scream, decay, and descend into campy lunacy. This hag horror era was the industry's final insult. It demanded that they weaponize their aging process for the amusement of a younger audience. Crawford, ever the victim of her own vanity, struggled with this transition. She found it increasingly difficult to reconcile the Joan Crawford of the MGM years with the haggard characters she was being asked to play in films like Trog, a movie about a prehistoric caveman that became her final humiliating screen credit. Davis, however, embraced the darkness with a frightening enthusiasm. She realized that if the world was going to view her as a monster, she would be the best monster they had ever seen. She took the hag label and wore it like a badge of honor, using it to secure a new generation of fans who admired her grit. The cost of their crowns was a profound, isolated loneliness. Both women had prioritized their careers over nearly everything else: husbands, children, and friendships. They had become caricatures of themselves, trapped in the narratives they had spent 50 years building. Crawford retreated into her New York apartment, becoming a recluse who refused to be photographed because she didn't want the world to see her without the mask. Davis, conversely, became a permanent fixture of the talk show circuit, essentially playing the character of Bette Davis until her final breath. When you look at their parallel legacies, you see two women who were essentially two sides of the same coin. They were both victims and victors of a studio system that demanded total devotion. They were the last of a breed of movie stars who understood that the image was a sacred trust. Their feud was not just a personal spat. It was a manifestation of the pressure to be the sole survivor in a town that only had room for one queen at a time. They were forged in the same fire, and while they spent their lives trying to extinguish each other, they only succeeded in making the blaze of their shared history burn brighter for future generations. The long fade. The final acts of Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were played out in a Hollywood that had become unrecognizable to the women who had helped build it. By the late 70s and 80s, the golden age was a ghost, and the two titans were left to navigate a landscape of television guest spots, low-budget horror, and the relentless march of time. For Crawford, the end was a quiet, self-imposed exile. After the critical disaster of Trog in 1970, she realized the camera was no longer her friend. She moved into a smaller apartment in New York City, surrounded herself with her collection of porcelain, and became increasingly reclusive. She gave up drinking, embraced Christian Science, and famously gave away her beloved jewelry. To the world, she remained the impeccable Joan Crawford, but behind closed doors, she was a woman facing the terrifying prospect of anonymity. Her death, in 1977, was a quiet coda to a life lived in a permanent spotlight. Bette Davis, however, refused to slip away. Her final years were characterized by a stubborn, almost heroic persistence. Despite suffering a major stroke and undergoing a mastectomy in the early 80s, she continued to work, appearing in television movies like White Mama and the cult classic The Whales of August in 1987. In the latter, she starred alongside another legend, Lillian Gish, and proved that while her body was frail, her Bette Davis fire was undiminished. She became a fixture on the talk show circuit, where she perfected the persona of the grand old broad of cinema. She was crusty, honest, and fiercely protective of her legacy, often using her airtime to take final parting shots at the industry and the rivals that had tried to discard her. The contrast in their final years perfectly summarized their lifelong conflict. Crawford died protecting the myth of her beauty. Davis lived to protect the reality of her craft. Crawford wanted the world to remember her as she was in Grand Hotel. Davis wanted the world to see every wrinkle she had earned. Even in their decline, they couldn't agree on how a legend should fade. When Crawford passed, Davis reportedly felt a sense of victory, but also a strange, hollowed-out loss. Her favorite sparring partner was gone, and without Crawford to fight, Davis was left to fight the only enemy she couldn't defeat: time itself. As the 80s drew to a close, Davis's health began to fail rapidly while she was in Europe to receive an award. She died in the American hospital in Neuilly-sur-Seine, France, on October 6, 1989. She had lived long enough to see her life turned into a legend. Her rivalry turned into a television miniseries, and her name synonymous with a brand of toughness that no modern actress could quite replicate. Both women died with their boots on, figuratively speaking, having never truly retired. They were the last of the Mohicans, the final remnants of a studio system that produced stars of such immense gravity that they warped the space around them. Their final years were not a slow fade, but a long, defiant glare into the sunset. Bette and Joan weren't just rivals. They were the twin pillars of a vanished era. Their war defined Hollywood's golden age of grit and glamour. If you enjoyed this deep dive into cinema's most legendary feud, please subscribe for more untold stories of history's greatest icons.